So why don't we just start by asking the audience, and I'm asking you, Tamsin, have you ever experienced sticky boundary situations at work? You can just drop a yes in the chat or wherever you're chatting, you guys. It could be an intrusive coworker asking you like really inappropriate questions, kind of like, why don't you have kids? What happened to your ex-husband? Why'd you guys get where was the person you brought to last year's Christmas party? I mean, I could keep going. I won't, but I could. Um, or the boss who calls you at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night and literally expects that you should pick up, even though it's not a part of your job description. So we have people saying, yes, 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 nepotism. Hella yeah. Yes.
Mm,
All right. So you're in the right place, is all I'm saying. What about
yeah.
you, Tamsin? You?
I think you took my top three. I think you took my top three. I gotta say, workplaces are interesting, right? Because you work really hard to fit in, to do a good job, to prove yourself, to be part of the team. And then I think that some people look at that as an open invitation to try to get some more information about you that
Mhm.
that didn't come with the job, and then you don't know what to do when that happens because you are trying to form those relationships. And it definitely happened to me over the years. I went through a divorce while I was on the air in the prime of my career, right after I turned 40 years old, and it was around the time people thought I you should have been starting to think about children or have be pregnant, and so I got that question quite a bit, and it was a boundary I had to learn to set because I felt like I was obligated to tell them
Mhm.
because they asked, and that's where I think we get really it gets very confusing at work.
Absolutely. And depends on how we were raised too. Women in particular were sort of raised to be good
Mhm.
girls. And I'm sure many of you out here raised to be good boys as well. And that there's something rude about not answering a
Sure.
question. So let's say that particular situation, just quickly, let's just talk about a quick script. If someone says, why don't you have children? You can say with a this kind of a face, right? We don't need to get aggressive in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-mm.
You can
Mm-mm.
say, why would you ask me that? Right. Now, this is from Kasia Urbaniak's work. She's a power dynamic expert, just so fantastic, her stuff. But flipping that script
Yeah.
is so powerful. And you can say it nicely. Why would you ask me that? Because what I find when I use that, and I have to say, I have definitely used that script in my life, the
Sure.
person immediately realizes that what they're asking simply because they are morbidly curious.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. I don't think it's most of the time not out of malice. It's not to find something out that they're going to spread. It's just really, really curious. But what it does to the other person is there's a lot of things that happen to that other person because there's a lot of emotions involved, and it doesn't even have to be that deep of a question. I think bosses calling it. Somebody wrote toxic boss, but bosses calling at different times a day, expecting an answer, expecting you to talk to them, and then that's the power struggle then of how do you deal with that? 'Cause that's a real
Well,
power struggle.
that's a great question. And actually, somebody sent in a question like about a boss expecting them to, they were on vacation and there's a non-time sensitive meeting and they want them
Mm.
to
Hmm.
virtually come to the meeting on their vacation, even though they're really not required to and it's not time sensitive. And they're like, yeah,
Oh,
but you're an executive and you have to do it. So my thought is two different things because we're talking about two different scenarios. But if a boss
yeah.
is, what we're really talking about with someone who has power to fire you, has power to pay you less,
Hmm.
has power
Hmm.
to really harm your career, the way that we approach boundaries with that person is absolutely going to be informed by that, right? It's not the same way that you're going to deal with
Yeah.
Bob from accounting who has no
Sure.
power to harm you, right?
Oh,
Your
so right.
boss,
Yep.
right,
Yep.
has power. So we got to think about, so the real thing is understanding like what did you agree to? Making
Hmm.
sure that when
Hmm.
you sign contracts with folks that you don't just sign contracts. Make sure a lawyer is looking at your contract. And listen, even if you don't have a
You're so
contract,
right.
make sure that you're clear about what you've agreed to. What is the expectation? And you can get that up front when you're talking, in the interview process once they want to hire you. it's
Yeah.
understanding the culture of the company, because you might have unwittingly, unknowingly sort of
Yeah.
signed on to a very toxic culture. And if that is the case, you need to talk to other people who work there too, if you can. So
Hmm.
HR is another thing, right? Human resources is another thing where you want to make sure what is required of you. Did you sign a contract that says you will be available 24/7 or whatever? So we figure out, what did we agree to? But I feel like early and often is the way to go with boundaries when we're talking about at work. You know, Someone
Mm.
had sent in, one of the questions was, how do I set boundaries when I'm sort of the new kid on the block? Basically, I'm new at the
Yeah.
office, and you want people to like you. And I'm like, here's the thing with boundaries when you're new. Yes, of course, we need to read the room and we need to understand the culture. And however you present those boundaries is how they're going to be received, which is why it's so important that you're clear about your boundaries. So, what are your boundaries? Your preferences, your desires, your limits, and your deal breakers. And,
Hmm.
for every person, they're different. For someone who does have kids, maybe working until 9 o'clock at night is not a part of what they're interested in doing. Maybe that's a deal
Right.
breaker for a job. If they can't be out by 6, they may not want to do it. So we need to know what that is for us, but how you set them, you being clear, and the energy with which you set a boundary is the energy with which it is received. Right. So if we do it
Mm.
all weird and apologetic and like, well,
Right.
sorry, but how do people receive it? Not great, right?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
like, I have a right to be mad at you,
Wishy-washy.
basically. Hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. You're right.
So,
We do start that sentence a lot of times with "I'm sorry, but," don't
hmm
we? Those 3 words. Wow.
yeah. And we don't want to, again, the apologizing. And for the Canadians in the group, I really feel bad for you guys, because it's even worse culturally, where so much apologizing. Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
like all the time. And what I really found in the work that I do is that a lot of times, especially if we would identify as a people pleaser, or maybe a recovering people pleaser, is that there is a lot of saying I'm sorry when I'm really pissed. I'm not actually sorry.
I'm annoyed. I'm
Yeah,
not sorry.
no, not sorry. So we want to really save the apology for when we feel that way. But I
Yeah.
wanted to get back to you, Tamsin. Entertainment, journalism, these are both industries that are notoriously bad for boundaries. One of the
Yeah.
producers here, Betsy, and I were talking about this earlier, where she was saying, the crazy hours, and especially you being a hard-hitting news anchor. So when there's, you've covered like really major things from hurricanes to Afghanistan. So how does that impact your boundaries and your personal life? Like, how does that meld together?
I think there's a couple of different types. There's the time part of that, which when you're dealing with something like a hurricane or you're going to Afghanistan, the time doesn't, you put those boundaries aside because you're dealing with human suffering and people suffering, and you're there to do a job, and that is the job, regardless of what your contract says. And it's kind of known, like that when you're covering news, like whatever hours you're needed, it's not a 9 to 5 job. It's not what you sign up for. And it's a spoken and an unspoken, and that was always way okay with me. The part that's hard, I think, is separating personal from professional, because when you're dealing with things like that, there are challenges you face because you don't expect to go into certain situations that you go into. We're not trained to know how to deal with things like that. I don't know who would be. And so I do remember, I was in Afghanistan for a short time. I covered Hurricane Sandy for the duration of it, but that human suffering and getting readjusted back to what I would call normal life after that kind of coverage was always really difficult for me. And it took me, especially Afghanistan, took me a long time because there's nothing I'd ever experienced before. But I had to I had to kind of relearn who I was. And it took me therapy, and it took me a lot of different things to say, like, okay, this is work. This is my
Mm.
person, this is who I am. There is going to be bleed over just in terms of emotion and being a person. But I had to relearn myself quite a bit. because when you do storytelling, you're really involved in someone else's story, and you can get very involved in that.
And you're really talking about emotional boundaries when you do the
Mhm.
work that you do, that how difficult it can be to, you're a human being and you're a very empathic person, I can say,
Yeah.
and highly sensitive. And so going into those situations, and you have to keep it together, even in a really rough
Mhm.
situation, those are really like, super high level boundaries when you're in high stakes situations. And yet, so many of us, so many people here who has careers where if you are a nurse, a doctor, a social worker, any kind of a helping person, even someone who, even a massage therapist, you have people talking to you about their
Mhm.
pain. You are
Mhm.
witnessing people suffering. And it's like, how do you not take that on? And I think that for me, I I was a talent agent for X number of years before I became a therapist. And I think I waited like an additional probably 3 years to make the move because I was so afraid I was going to have like clients sleeping on my couch. Like I was so afraid that my emotional boundaries would be
Yeah.
like, could I separate myself? And of course, going to grad school, I learned that
Sure.
having them sleeping on my couch would be bad for them and bad for me, besides
Mhm.
being
Mhm.
unethical and probably against the law. But I didn't understand how healthy boundaries protect relationships. I didn't
Yeah.
understand it to the degree, of course, obviously 25 years later that I do now because I've become an expert in it. But at the
Sure.
time, it was worrisome. You know what I mean?
Well, I think the emotional ones, yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, I think you probably had to do a lot of restudying. Those are two very different careers, but then probably there is a lot of overlap there because you are dealing with people's careers. You're dealing with emotions of the heart in either one of those situations, right?
Yeah.
So, or affairs of the heart. What you're dealing with is people and how they feel about themselves and how they're
Yep.
perceived and their confidence. So I guess it really is an interesting. I think I always thought that was just such an amazing pivot that you did, but really it was kind of a shift into something to help people that you were probably dealing with all along.
It's so true. People will say, "Oh, it was so different." And I was like, "No, it was so much the same. I was just now
Yeah,
finally going to get paid for doing what I was already naturally doing and most interested in doing, which was helping people and their mental wellness. Like that was really my thing. And I knew I needed to leave because I didn't care about the Pantene deal or the movie deals I was negotiating. Like I realized like I literally only care about getting this person into rehab. Like,
yeah,
and that's not
yeah.
actually my
Wow.
job here. So
Right. That's it.
I knew
That's
it
an
was
extra
time to
job.
go.
I always think
Exactly.
people worry about boundaries that someone's going to get mad at them if they establish them, and I think that was a lot of times what I dealt with in my career. I would get concerned, taking it outside of a storytelling or the job, concerned someone is going to get mad at me and not like me if I choose myself or choose my
Yeah,
boundary over them. And I that probably carries through most careers.
it absolutely does. And I think that the more confident we become in boundary setting, though, the easier it is. And again, it's changing our minds about what it means. And that's
Mhm.
what the book is about. And that's what the workbook is about, is changing your mind about what it means. Because what really happens when we get masterful at boundaries, and I know you know, because you really are a boundary boss, is that people respect us. People feel safe with us because they know
Mm.
you're not bullcrapping them. They know you're telling the
Yep.
truth. If you say no, it's because you can't. You know, another thing I wanted to explore
Trust.
quickly
It
before we
establishes
take,
trust.
oh, it absolutely does. Another thing I wanted to explore quickly before I want to take
Mhm.
a question from someone in Sounds True One is, you know, Betsy had said how she was struck by the fact that she thought that you jumped from the frying pan journalism into the fire digital content such as TikTok.
Oh.
to, and talk about another insatiable beast in a way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's actually just talk a little bit about how do you manage your boundaries around having this robust digital arm of your business,
Yeah.
being out there.
Yeah, that this has been a new one for me. It's really been a learning curve because as a journalist through those years, if people contact you, it's emails or they get to you and there's a story or there's something they want you to cover or pitches. I'll open a mailbox and have like 500 emails, but they're not necessarily somebody's emotions. It's somebody's, opening of the restaurant or some new product that they have.
Right.
But with digital and with the community that we've really built there, I would say that, like I'm sure that you have even more so, is there are real emotions and they're real people and they're real concerns, or they're upset about something or looking for advice. And most of mine is talking about midlife and menopause and finding meaning in all of it. And so I felt like at one point I'm like, I have to answer everybody and make sure that everybody gets and I still do try to do that as much as possible, but I've established now, instead, yes, I can do as many as possible, but they have to be within a certain amount of time, and it can't be every minute that they come over. And because I've really had to
Yep.
learn, otherwise I was not in my life. I would go through a weekend and not realize my weekend had just happened. Or,
Yep.
I'm pretty newly married of 2 years, and I'd be sitting there with my husband at our anniversary, and I'm like, hold on, I just gotta just do one more message. And he's like, what are you doing? What are you doing?
Right.
We're ordering food. So I've had to
Right.
learn, I have to establish my own. I have time blocks in place, even in my calendar in pink, to give me where I get my breaks between going to the studio or to working digital, because it's a real community there. It's a living, breathing community, and it's
Yeah.
not, you're talking with them, not at them.
Right. It's a real thing.
Mhm.
What we have done, because I was the same, right? When I was starting and coming up and just feeling like so overly responsible for every
Mhm.
person and everything. And then we started having more canned responses, meaning Terry can answer this question, but you have to ask it in a public place. Yeah, you have to ask it
Oh,
somewhere.
great.
And I also,
Smart.
listen, we refer people to other therapists and do stuff like
Yeah.
that all the time, obviously, and give people resources, especially if someone's in trouble. But and they can, of course, you can ask the questions anonymously, but if it's in a public space, then like
Yeah.
thousands or tens of thousands or whoever are benefiting from it,
That's
right? I
so
can't
smart.
answer a question that's like 44 paragraphs long that's only about one person,
Right.
because like you said, we would never do anything else but that.
That's such a smart way to do it. Yeah, and I think, and a lot of the questions apply to so many people, and so the questions that people are asking are good, but you never want to violate somebody, right? So asking them to ask it in a public space is such a great idea, because I think so many people can be helped with that. And I find that people are pretty comfortable being out there with their questions. If they're on social in the first place,
Yep.
they have a good idea that somebody else might be dealing with the same thing. And so I think they would feel comfortable with that.